Is the Ricoh GR a good enough camera for 2021? For the last few years, cameras have been getting very high tech, and it's easy to become entrenched in that belief that when the new model comes out, the older models are no longer sufficient to make great photos with. And you need these newer ones to improve yourself somehow and make you a better photographer. But deep down, I think that we all know that that's bollocks, and all we really need is a camera that we like, we know how to use, and a lot of practice. The Ricoh GR was released in 2013, and it has this aps-c size sensor somehow wedged into this tiny little point and shoot size body. But now that the GR3 was released back in 2019, is there any point in having this old guy around still? As always, I am not the best with technical specs of things. I just use the camera and offer my review or point of view and opinions on how it is to shoot with. I'll throw on the screen some photos that I've took with this camera over the last couple months so that you can get an idea of how the images look. And all of the pictures are JPEGs straight out of camera, or at least raw processed in camera. None of it's edited in Lightroom or anything. So these are all colors and styles that you can get straight from this. So the first thing about the Ricoh GR is the size and form factor. One of the barriers that I found to street photography or just shooting photos more often was that when I had full frame cameras, they were just kind of big and clunky and very difficult to carry around day to day or for even just long periods of time sometimes. If I wasn't out specifically to shoot, the camera would get left at home, and sometimes I would miss out on images or shoot it with my phone, which is fine. Often I just didn't get photos that way. But with a little camera like this, it can just go in my pocket, it doesn't get in the way. Even if it's on a strap, it's so light that it can just hang around your neck or across your shoulder or whatever, and you barely notice that it was there. And for that reason, I would carry this camera or any other small camera anywhere with me, and then I've always got a camera handy. And to me, that helps me to practice, to shoot more, and eventually become a slightly better photographer because of it. And when I talk about ergonomics, the size plays a factor in the ergonomics of this camera. It's the only camera that I've ever had that truly feels like it can be fully one-handed use. I think a combination of its size, its lightweight, and all the buttons being sort of reachable with your thumb. You can hold, you know, your other hand can be, I don't know, holding on to something else if you're carrying bags or something, and you really just need this. You can switch it on, take shots, adjust settings, and it's comfortable. I don't feel like I'm gonna drop it. Whereas even with small cameras, I've got the X100 close by. It's not quite possible because the X100 is a little heavier, but if you need to adjust the aperture, you can sort of do it with one hand, but it's not that comfortable. And focus and ring is here, and your drive delete button is much further over, so it's just not quite as one-handable as the Ricoh GR is. And this could be a fairly insignificant thing to most people, but sometimes you only have one hand free and you're just trying to be quick and you want to grab a quick snap of something. This is just a little bit easier. If it removes barriers and makes the shooting experience easier, this might be something to consider. And although the X100 is not exactly a camera to really compare this to, it often is. The closer Fuji relative would be the X70, which I think was released maybe around the same time, maybe a little bit after. And the X70 is about the same size. However, I believe it's not as one-handable. It has not a focus ring, it has a ring here that adjusts settings, and I think sometimes it's just, you need that second hand to make that change in settings. The autofocus is admittedly a little bit slow on this, especially when it gets down to low light or slightly lower contrast scenes, which is common, but I do feel like this camera suffers from it a little bit more than some other cameras that I have. I also find that it's not super intuitive to move the focus point around. In fact, I have never managed to really figure out how to move the focus point around, but to be fair, I haven't really tried. I tend to shoot it with manual focus or snap focus. And with 18mm, the depth of field usually isn't that shallow anyways, so not having the focus like critically on that exact point doesn't necessarily mean that it's out of focus anyways. So talking about manual and snap focus, the snap focus function is quite useful. There's a couple different ways to use it. There's a thing called full press snap. Personally, I have found this snap focus, full press snap to be slow, at least on this model, or at least on my copy, because the focus mechanism still has to move there in order for it to then take the picture at that. It's not as instantaneous as I'd like it to be, which is why I prefer the manual focus or regular snap. So if it's in regular snap, this function 1 button allows me to choose the distance that I want it to be at. So if I set it to 1.5 meters, the shutter, the aperture to f8, everything from just under or around a meter to 5 meters will be in focus. And 5 meters is plenty for a 28mm equivalent field of view. Anything beyond that's too small in the frame, and 1 meter is a pretty good distance. And actually, because it's, if you're at f8, things that are closer than a meter are still kind of in focus. They're not really that blurry. So you can get away with it being out with the what is said to be the accepted focus of the camera. If you suddenly need autofocus, you can back button focus, which will lock it on whatever you focus on with the autofocus thing. Or you can press this function 2 button, which will take you to the autofocus, and I'm out of focus now, aren't I? Or you can also, if you're in snap focus, press this function 2 button, which will just take you into autofocus mode. And when you're done autofocusing on whatever, you can click it back and it'll go back to snap focus at your 1.5 or 1 meter or whatever you had it set at. Sounds a little complicated. If you generally just leave it at, you know, your usual distance, you know what your zone is, most stuff's in focus, you don't really ever use the other stuff, or I find that I don't anyways. But if you're a shallow depth of field kind of shooter, I mean, probably just leave this video and forget about the Ricoh at this point, because it's never going to be a shallow depth of field camera. So the image quality, that is something that we sort of consider a lot these days, and often image quality takes the driving seat of people's buying choices. I mean, this camera has 16 megapixels on a crop sensor, which is nothing for most cameras, even phones nowadays, but it delivers really good quality even though it's limited by the megapixels that it has. It has an extremely sharp lens on it that works really well with the sensor, and somehow this older sensor technology produces this look that I think is going to become popular going forward in the future. A lot of photographers now talk about their old gear having some sort of like magic in their sensor, something special that the newer, more high-tech, sort of clean-cut sensor technology doesn't have. And the Ricoh GR has that in it as well. The images look good. I wouldn't say they exactly look like film, but people say that these older sensors are closer to film than newer digital sensors are. And that makes sense pretty much to me, I think. I don't tend to pixel peep that much, but this camera does produce sort of colors and a look to images that I don't get from any of my other cameras. People said this same thing about the original Canon 5D, about Fuji X Pro 1 and XT ones, even I think the X100, and anything with that older sensor technology seems to get good press nowadays. And it's my feeling that this type of thing will become the film of the future, where people start to feel nostalgic about old sensor technology. Now, I know I may have gotten off of the image quality topic a little bit there, but yes, it's sharp and the colors are good. And one of the draws of this camera is the positive film picture style, which is what I think most people say gives it that film sort of look. Linked to the image quality is low light performance. And as with any older digital camera, it's not that good. You'll start to see grain round about ISO 1600, I think. 3200, there's definitely grain. 6400 and above, you're noticing the grain, no problem. So if you're really not into grain and it bothers you that much, then you're probably looking at newer cameras anyways, but I really don't mind it. I can deal with it. I actually shot a photo recently at ISO 16000. I wasn't really thinking about it, to be honest. I would not usually have gone that high, but I forgot to change my settings from a 500th of a second and f8 when I went indoors, so the ISO just bumped up really high. to compensate for that, and I got this very grainy picture with some color noise in it. That being said, I'm confident that if I printed that picture, it would look grainy, but you would not see as much of that ugly color noise than you do as you do on the digital screen. I'm gonna have to print that picture now just to kind of prove to myself that it could actually look pretty good. I mentioned earlier that the GR has a fixed 18.5mm lens, which on a full frame camera is about the same field of view as a 28mm lens. I know some people don't like to compare that, but when you think in 35mm terms, it's easier to convert and understand what that field of view is going to look like. So forgive me if you're more of a call it what it is type focal length person. And while all sorts of focal lengths are used for street photography, 28mm is kind of a classic. Gary Winogrand famously used 28mm for I think pretty much all of his work that I've seen. I think William Klein used 28mm, and Daido Moriyama also I think used 20mm, and I think used a GR as well. And many other street photographers have always stuck to that 28mm focal length. Now, while it's very much geared towards that street shooting style, you can also make great use of that in everyday life, especially photographing your family and events and things like that, where you're indoors in a confined space, or you want to get a lot of people or information in the frame. I think in any situation where a small camera with a relatively wide lens would be helpful is what this camera can translate to, even though it's geared towards street, or at least designed initially with street photography in mind. And yes, there is always your phone. Your phone has a similar field of view, is probably just about as good in low light sometimes, but there's an experience that comes with using a camera that I don't think you get from a mobile phone. And if you don't get as much satisfaction from shooting with your phone, then a little camera like this might be just the thing you need. Now, the menu system. It's a camera from 2013. The menu system is smaller than newer cameras. There's less features in there. It's a little bit clunky. It looks kind of dated. Sometimes it can even be a little bit confusing to use, but it's fine. Once you get the camera kind of set how you like it, you probably will find that you won't really go into the menu that much. This camera just kind of worked. I don't know if the custom settings all come like that from standard. I did buy it used, but someone has these settings set up the way pretty much that I would like them to be, and I don't change a lot on the camera. I shoot very simply with it, and I think it lends itself to that type of thing. But the camera does seem to be very customizable. You've got 2 or 3 different custom function buttons, and I don't think you should really need more than that for the amount of features that this has. It feels solid, pretty solidly built. It's light, it's lightweight, I mean it's plasticky, but for a compact camera it does have a bit more heft to it than other compact cameras might, or at least ones that I've held anyways. It still is sort of a premium camera, but it is old, so the materials also feel a little bit cheaper and plasticier than newer cameras do. I wouldn't want to drop it. I wouldn't be confident that it would survive a drop necessarily, but it's been around since 2013 and it still works just fine. So talking about value, you can find these for round about $300 to $350 used. That seems kind of expensive for an old compact camera when you can buy an old full frame Canon 5D for $300. But as I said, it depends on what you really need. If you need a small compact camera, a 5D is probably not the camera for you, and something like this is. And since the Ricoh GR is becoming more rare, and at the same time they're becoming more popular, the original is probably not going to depreciate much more. If anything, it might go up in value. So if the GR fits into your style of shooting and into your lifestyle, then it can be excellent value because it's $330, which is cheaper than a lot of other smaller cameras that you might get, particularly an X100V. But if it doesn't fit your style, then it's not going to offer you much value at all. I think that this is clearly a niche and soon to be vintage camera. One thing that a lot of people appreciate about the older GR models is that it still has a flash. This is one of the few buttons that you have to use a second hand to activate. And having the flash is, for some people, it doesn't really matter because they don't really shoot flash, and for other people, they shoot in low light environments, they shoot street, and they like that look of that flash style. Then this is a great thing to have built in. The newer model, the Ricoh GR3, does not have a flash. Instead, it has IBIS, which personally I don't care about, but a lot of people do like to have it. So if you are an IBIS person and want a camera like this with it, you're gonna have to go for the GR3. It costs a lot more money, but you will get your IBIS. One of my favorite things about this camera, and one of the reasons that I actually got one to try it out, was the fact that it has a nice quiet shutter. So if you listen, that little click, I don't know how loud it sounds on the microphone, but you might not even really be able to hear it from further away. It's very quiet and very subtle, so if you're in any outdoor environment, you can barely hear this clicking, and it's just far less intrusive than a camera that has a normal click. Like my old X-T2, wonderful camera, but when you're up close, it had a loud enough click that people would hear it and look round at you, which is fine. I don't mind people necessarily looking at me or catching me. I don't try to hide it, but it just has a much more gentle feeling about it. Like, it's less intrusive, and I enjoy that sort of softness of a smaller camera that doesn't make much noise. So in conclusion, depending on your style of street photography, this camera might not be of any interest to you. It's not a camera for getting blurry backgrounds and out of focus elements. It's a camera where generally you're going to get a lot more stuff in focus. It has some limitations, it has a lot of limitations that might be too restrictive for how you like to shoot and the things that you want to shoot. But if your style fits into the things that this camera does well, then it can be one of the most freeing shooting experiences that you've ever had. I'm not necessarily saying it should replace your main camera, but maybe as an extra sidearm, something that you carry with you at times when your normal camera is not as practical, or just something to have to switch it up from your other cameras. Some people might find that they can shoot exclusively with this camera. Some people might not warm up to it that much, and that's totally understandable. I'm not saying that this is the camera that you should get for street photography, but it is certainly an option for a lot of people. I'd been wondering about it for a while. I really didn't think it was going to be as fun as it has been. And I know 2 people who have sold their X100Vs to get a GR2 and a GR3. I won't be selling my X100 anytime soon, but I do really like having this camera. Alright, drop me a comment down below. Let me know if I missed anything. Let me know if you've tried one of these, if you had one, didn't like it. Any of your experiences is good to hear in the comments for other people to get a slightly different perspective as well. So thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.